Hi everyone and welcome. My name is James Proctor and this session is called Seeing the Data Around Us. So we're looking here at a satellite image of the area around the GitHub office in San Francisco. But my goal here is to get us thinking about data at a bit more of like a human first person kind of scale. So what we're going to do today, we're going to go through some introductions. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and where I work. And then we're going to go through data collection, where we're probably going to spend most of our time. And then we're going to get into analysis and sketching, right? So finding patterns in that data. And then finally, visualization. So like thinking about, well, how do we refine sketches? How do we try to get towards a finished product? And the goal here really is to go start to finish through the visualization process, because we want to think about and understand that process, right? More so than worrying about creating like an amazing visual right away. We want to like understand, a pattern that we can use in the future. So I'm going to show you an example piece that I made recently, just kind of going through these steps, did it over the weekend. And you'll see it's really simple, right? So I would encourage you to do something like not too complicated like that to start with, just because, makes it manageable. And it'll give you a pattern to follow in the future. So, First, me. I'm James Proctor. I'm a data visualization engineer at a company called Pitch Interactive. And I'm also an artist. And, in both of those sort of capacities, I work a lot with software and digital tools. I'm interested in themes, but in particular, the built environment. So things like housing and transportation, which are really pressing issues here in the Bay Area where I live. And I think those things are interesting because I think they reflect our values, right? What sort of things get built and for whose benefit. Pretty interesting, kind of tells you a lot. So a lot of my suggestions will be about things in the physical world and public space, because that's where my mind tends to go. But I would say, you should choose topics you're interested in, right? Because that'll make this much more fun for you. Another thing that kind of became a theme in this presentation, sort of unintentionally, is COVID. We're going to see a few different pieces that relate to that. So I don't know, prepare yourself. Wasn't my intent. But so Pitch Interactive, where I work, is a studio that creates data visualizations and interactive experiences. So we do work across a pretty wide range of media. Web apps and interactives are probably the thing we do most often, but, we've worked on physical installations, projections, pieces for print. So I'm going to share a few examples here with you to just give you a sense for the work, kind of where I'm coming from. So this is a piece called Out of Sight, Out of Mind, and it's about drone strikes in Pakistan. This is probably one of the pieces we're better known for. It's something we would call like a narrative visualization. And we worked here with data from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. And the idea was to take this thing that's, Americans often feels very distant and kind of intangible. And we wanted to use choices of things like animation and color in the way that we presented it to kind of give it the appropriate weight, right? To make this thing sort of visible and affecting. Another piece, this one has sort of a personal angle on it because we're based in California. This is called Drought Monitor, and it grew out of work we had done in print for Scientific American. And we were sort of interested to add a little more to that story. So some of it's like new data, but some of it's also this interactive component, this ability to kind of look at particular seasons in more detail. And at a high level, what the story is here is really that these extreme wet and dry conditions have become more frequent and more volatile over time, particularly in the last few decades. You see that towards the right side of the graph, in addition to the sort of overall drying trend in California that I guess we all know about. This is the last example I'll show you. This is a visualization of COVID cases, right? You've probably seen maps like this. And the thing that makes this one a little bit distinct is sort of its purpose. So we created it in partnership with a group called Big Local News. They're out of Stanford University. And we had some support as well from the Google News Initiative. And so the purpose, like our goal in creating it, was for it to be a tool for journalists. So it has a bunch of sort of embedded options for embedding, right? So that if you have an article about a particular area, you can sort of select kind of the level of focus. So we've got country level. In most cases, where we can, we've got state or province level views. And then within the US, we can actually go down to specific counties. And so, it's set up such that, you can have this included in an article and just always have up-to-date visuals to go along with it. So, I mentioned our format. I'll just kind of hit those points again, right? Data collection, analysis and sketching, and visualization. And so why are we doing it this way? I'm going to make a few references to things like paper and pencil. What's all that about? This is adapted from a workshop that I've run in person in the past. And the idea there has typically been that, over the course of, a day or whatever it is, over the course of the session, we're going to walk through those steps, go out and collect the data, do the sketching, create a visualization. And, again, the point is sort of the same point that I mentioned before. So we want to keep the focus on the process. And so for those in-person workshops, generally, I emphasize using analog tools because it's great to not have to debug everyone's setup and just kind of get going right away. But we're not going to do that today because you're doing this on your own time, right? If you're already familiar with, a digital tool that you want to use, that's great. You can go for it. I use things like D3 and React and different libraries, daily, right? They're great tools. They're really wonderful technologies. But I would say, however you sort of choose to approach this, what I want to encourage you to do is just keep that focus on process in mind. So just, don't get too hung up on what's easy or hard to do in a particular library. Don't worry about making a visual that's really flashy. Just try to go through this in a way where you can think through the process, and then that will be applicable to your next project, right? Where maybe you get a little more ambitious. So we're going to start off with data collection. I sort of said this before, but we're going to spend more time on this step because that's the seeing part of seeing the data around us, and also because a lot of technical tutorials on data visualization start you off with a sample data set. And that's great, for getting out of the gate and learning a new technique or something. But we want to start with the collection itself. And the reason for that is, right, it's good to see the messiness of encoding information from the world, right? So the real world is fuzzy. There's just a ton of detail there. You're not going to capture it all. You're going to have to make judgment calls about what's important and what counts, in terms of the story that you want to tell. This is kind of a silly example, right? But something that seems really simple would be okay, I'm going to watch people, walk by on the street, look out my window and say, what are the colors of the clothes that they're wearing, right? Just think that would be pretty simple, right? But say someone goes by and you're oh, is that a red shirt or a mauve shirt? Or what if they're wearing a complex pattern, right? They got paisley on or something. You're okay, well, do I mark down the dominant color? Do patterns get their own category? Do different patterns get their own category? So again, it's a little silly, but these are good things to be aware of, because then when you do get someone else's data set, you can approach it with that kind of critical eye and say, okay, what were the sort of editorial choices that went into this, right? Their methodology, how did they choose it? Why? And it's not to say that any of that's sinister, right? You have to reduce complexity in order to, tell an effective story, in order to kind of make that information manageable. But it also, it should be something that you're aware of. In terms of actually collecting the data, there's all sorts of ways to go about it. Again, there's wonderful technologies like databases and spreadsheets and stuff. But all tools have different strengths and weaknesses, and they often will push you in a particular direction. So, I would encourage you to kind of think about, well, what do I want to find out, and then choose a method that will work well for that. So, paper and pencil are great because they're really flexible. You're not going to do a big data set with them, right? It'd be very time consuming, but You can add or drop characteristics on the fly. You can kind of make notes in the margins, and you can also use sort of expressive marks or symbols. There's tally apps, right? So maybe you're going to go out into the world and you just want to mark down things in particular categories. That'll be well suited for that, but it's less flexible. You won't necessarily be able to like add something on the fly. Other things to consider, maybe you want to take photos to capture those colors, or you're going to record some audio to get levels. So all sorts of different things can work. I'm going to show a couple of examples now of sort of novel methods of data collection. So this is a piece by artist Ekene Ejioma, and he set up this website and a phone line that allows people to call in, record their voices, and then also there's a way for others to kind of help identify and transcribe their messages. And so this is for a piece called Accounting, and so it's like a series of voice portraits for different U.S. cities, right? So I think this is really cool. It's done in response to the census, right? You can sort of see that, but it's also capturing this more nuanced kind of personal thing than the census does, right? Like the human voice. Another sort of novel example, right? This is what Nicholas Felton calls photo visualization. So he's sort of aggregating these photos, and the story is about how they, come together to form patterns. So all sorts of things can be methods for collecting your data, right? Keep your options open. And just, I've given you a few examples here for things you might want to collect. You don't need to use these, but just to kind of get your mind going, you might look out your window and say, well, okay, what kind of birds do I see in the yard? How many raccoons are trying to dig into my trash? Maybe you go through your ticket stubs. There's all kinds of things you can do, right? The main recommendation I would make here is, well, sort of two things. The one is choose something you're interested in. Because that'll just make this much more enjoyable. If it's something you find boring, you won't want to spend time with it. And that's the second thing, is that allow a good chunk of time here, because often, like in the process of collecting data, you might get new ideas. You might change your mind about what's interesting. So you could go out in the world and maybe something catches your eye that's different. And so, give yourself that chance to like add a dimension to your data or change approaches. Because that's fine and it'll be more interesting. The other thing I want to sort of stay at this stage are two sort of disclaimers, right? And the one is, we've mentioned a few different sort of suggestions or projects that involve data on people. And what I would say is just like, if you are going to record data on human beings, just be thoughtful, be circumspect, right? Don't creep anybody out. Don't share information that could put someone at risk. Just kind of consider, like, how would you feel if someone was recording this data about you? And, the other thing is then, hey, yourself, be careful, right? So don't put yourself in a risky situation, use good judgment, consider your own safety as well. And if you're looking for more inspiration about things to collect, a really cool project that you could look at is this book called Dear Data. And so this is something that Stephanie Posifek and Georgia Lupi created. They're both really impressive data viz practitioners. But here what we're sort of seeing is these interesting, like, experimental and very sort of like personal visualizations that they created. So the project was that they, every week for a year, they collected a particular sort of personal data about their lives and then made a visualization on like a postcard and mailed it to each other. So really, really interesting project. Lots of cool ideas there. And so, as I mentioned, I went through this process myself over the weekend. And I went with the paper and pencil route, but again, do what suits you. But you probably will not be surprised to learn that a lot of the restaurants in my neighborhood have added outdoor seating recently. And I got interested in, like, well, how many people are using these tables? Like, what does that actually look like? So I decided to record some data about that. So I went out with my notebook and I started kind of counting seats and how many were filled. And then I kind of realized, well, there's actually other things that are interesting about this. Like where are those seats? So, like, are they right on the sidewalk, or are they in a parklet or an existing like patio space or something? And I played with a few different ways of recording that as well. So you can see there's like some little pictograms, there's labels and counts. And I sort of also wrote little notes to myself, like stuff I wasn't sure how to deal with. So, ideally at this point, we're going to move on to analysis and sketching. And, so hopefully you've gone out, you've collected some data. So, like, Now the thing to say is, well, what does it say? What's interesting about it? How do you want to present that story? And so, one of the first things you can look at is like, did what you record match your expectations? So this will, maybe sounds a little familiar from science class or something. Like, you went in with a rough hypothesis, probably, about what you might find. And if you did, like, well, did it pan out, or is there something surprising there? The other big thing to look for is patterns, right? So maybe you're counting how many people are walking down different streets, and you notice, oh, there's more people on this one. That one's sunny. Oh, it's because it's warmer, right? So, think about, oh, is there like a story that explains this? Another thing that might happen is you realize you don't actually have enough information, and, maybe there's other questions that you have, or pieces of context that would like help you better understand what it is you saw. And so, that can be a cause to like go back and gather some more information, or maybe you want to pose that question in your sketches. So have group sketching analysis together, because they really are linked, right? Often trying a way of presenting something will help you see a pattern that you didn't before. And so there's all sorts of ways to sort of encode your data as well. So these are obviously not comprehensive examples, but just keep in mind, color can be used for all sorts of things. You can use shapes, symbols, locations, right, like on a map or within like a scatter plot, line weight. And then, there's also different kinds of values you can show, right? You can show raw counts. You can show the share of a whole that something contributes, and sort of other ways of comparing categories. And then there's lots of different chart types. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but often different chart types are well suited to different kinds of data, but there's a huge variety of them, right? So good to know sort of what your options are. But before we get into that, I just want to show you a couple of sketches that I made, right? So we're back to the example project. We're looking at outdoor dining. And I made a few different ones here, and really the big thing to take away from this is just like, again, the process, right? So I'm not getting too hung up here, as you can definitely tell. I'm like making the lines clean. The scale is way off. But what I'm trying to figure out is like, well, what's interesting about this? What's going to be useful to include? And like, how do these elements sit together in context? So, kind of iterating on that previous one, I was like, well, okay, like the proportion of all seats filled is sort of interesting, but what if we group it by the table? Because then you can see like, well, some of the tables are bigger than others, and is that interesting? And this is also where I sort of was like, I really think like where they are, like if they're on the sidewalk versus like a patio or parklet, like that's interesting. So I started adding labels, but that was kind of like an afterthought. And so it's not maybe the clearest. And so I was like, well, let's push that forward. So here are these little pictograms where I've kind of drawn, okay, there's like a structure around the people, or here's a little empty chair, or a little person sitting in it, which is, cool, but like maybe a little too complicated. So I sort of took that and simplified it down, right? This is like kind of an abstracted version of that. You can almost think of it like looking at the tables from above. And they're sort of just these circles. But if you do know what it is, then maybe it's a little easier to see at a glance, like, okay, these are occupied and those aren't. So coming back to the chart types, it can be really valuable at this stage to look at other people's charts. And it's also good to have a sense for like what kinds of diagrams are going to be well suited to different kinds of data. So I'll just give a couple of examples. One that you're probably familiar with, you think of like stock performance or something, like line graphs being used to show change over time, right? Time series kind of things. Another that you might have seen is if your computer's like hard drive is full and you're trying to be like, oh, like what's using all this, that might be presented as a tree map, because that shows like hierarchy, like the nested folders, as well as like how much of the whole they are apart, like how much they take up. And there's also different resources that you can use for this kind of information. But I think the link in this slide, and this will be in session resources as well, it does a good job of giving just like a basic overview of a wide variety of chart types. Something else to consider is that when you're sketching, kind of what you want to do is make it easy and low cost to try out a bunch of different ideas. So you don't want to have to spend a ton of time on a given option, but you want to be able to kind of switch between things quickly. So in this case, kind of what I'm showing you here is like an exploratory tool. So this was like playing with different ways of presenting COVID data on a map. And you can see it's got this like really ugly kind of cluttered interface, because what we were doing here is like playing around with different map styles and different rendering options. And so, all those controls are going to go away, right? We're going to pick one that's the best once we've kind of tried them all together. And then, all the sort of like less favored ones are going to get cut out once you settle on that like core story and presentation style. Something else you might want to do is, you might decide that your data and its story are better expressed in like a less conventional form. So maybe you want to use things like sculpture or sound. And Akene Ijeoma, who I mentioned before, has this really cool piece called Wage Islands. And it visualizes where in New York City low-wage workers can afford to rent as topography. So it's created with these stacked acrylic sheets where affordable places are higher and less affordable places are lower. And to really sort of illustrate the point, he actually submerges it in water. Another sort of similar example, you might also think, well, being able to get specific numerical values might not be your first priority. Maybe it's just about, the general trend or creating like a feeling or interest. And then maybe you reveal details later, right? So this one's called Air Transformed. This is by Stephanie Poslovic. And this is based on open air quality data from Sheffield in the UK, which is kind of known for its bad air. And once you know what it is, you can sort of say, oh, I bet that spiky one is some bad air. And you can sort of see how things progressed over time, even though you don't necessarily know what the values are. So, at this point, we've spent some time with our data. We've considered some narratives and different ways of presenting it. And it can be tough to choose among your sketches, right? But often a particular direction will start to stand out as, more interesting. And this doesn't necessarily mean throwing out your other ideas. You might also want to go with like a synthesis of a few different approaches. But it is best to choose sort of a core narrative of some kind, because that can help you make other choices, like what tools you want to use. So like if you're going with a map, you might say, okay, well, I'm going to use Mapbox or Leaflet. Or if you want to do like simulation or have lots of particles, well, maybe then you say, okay, I want to use something performant like Open Frameworks or WebGL, Pixie or DeckGL, things like that. And so here's the final visualization that I created. And so it's definitely, it's not the most impressive piece I'm going to show you today, right? But you can see like kind of how it's a progression from the sketches, right? It's a bit more polished. It's a little easier to read. I broke out the ruler for a couple of things here. And, hopefully this also feels like sort of an achievable target, right? If you're doing this over the course of an afternoon or something. So what to focus on here is like how this pulls ideas from a few of the different sketches. I kind of took those like abstracted top-down shares. But then I was also like, well, that's not enough on its own. We need to have these groupings by, parklet or patio, and we also need labels and annotations for the count, just to kind of give it more context. So, and another thing is like when you're actually at that implementation stage, this is where those sort of technical tutorials or, looking at examples of other people's code can be really valuable. So, and going in with that level of specificity is good, because then, say you're like, oh, I know I want to make an animated line chart. Well, you can search for that specifically. And that way you avoid getting sort of steered towards just like what's easy to do, or, whatever's like the common thing in the tool that you happen to grab first. So I'm showing Flowing Data here. This is a really great site. It's a good resource because they have a lot of like essays and analysis on data as well as tutorials. And those are all things that can be really helpful to reference as you're refining your sketches into a finished product. A few more examples here, kind of get you thinking. This is a piece called by Mona Chalabi. She's a data journalist who uses this really unique illustrative style. And, in this example, right, the point is sort of less about perfect accuracy than kind of giving you a sense of scale by using a familiar metaphor. So she has this kind of mountain, right? And so instead of saying, 70,000, that's just kind of really big, right? It's like hard to kind of get a sense for that. Like having this metaphor to put numbers in context, is actually really helpful. And the other thing you'll notice here is like it's a pretty spare visual. There's not a lot of like extraneous stuff. And, that's another thing that's often a part of going from sketch to visualization is figuring out, well, what can you remove? Like, what are the most interesting parts? What are the most important parts? You know, I often find it really fun to put in controls to like filter and manipulate your data. Those things can be great to play with, but for for a broad audience that may not be as familiar with the topic and definitely isn't as familiar with the controls that like you built, removing options or pre-selecting the most interesting moments and kind of guiding your audience through that is often more effective. And then that's not to say that complexity is bad, right? But it is a place that where it's important to get feedback, right? So this is a really awesome interactive by Shirley Wu. It's like a visualization simulation game. But also like because it's so complicated, like I would say, hey, for something like this, like you would want to do like play testing, right? Like you would for a video game, right? Bring in people, have them look at it cold and see like, can they figure it out? Can they follow along? Like, because it's sort of like proofreading something you write, where it's really easy to bring your own prior knowledge and assumptions to this visualization that you've created. So showing it to other people, ideally a cross-section of different people, or like if you have a specific audience in mind, kind of trying to find people representative of that, can be just really valuable to make sure that you're getting your story across in a way that your viewer can digest. So that's our session.